Good morning. We are on 99A1, Tzadi Tes Amud Aleph. Here we go. So the Mishnah spoke about the fact that a person is allowed to stand in the public domain and move something in the private domain, or stand in the private domain and move something in the public domain. So the Gemara says, though, that could only be done if a person doesn't move the object more than 4 amos, right? So a person standing in the private domain, let's say they are reaching through a window or they're on a rooftop and they're leaning down and they can move something from here to here, but as long as they don't move it more than 4 amos. Now the Gemara is going to discuss 2 different possible inferences from those words. So v'vad yotzi chutz. So as long as you move it more than 4 amos, the Gemara then makes the following implication: hahotzi chayiv chatas. But if you do move it more than 4 amos, then you're going to have to bring a chatas. This would seem to support the following statement of Rava. Rava said, "Hamavir chayfetz mitchilas arba losof arba veviro derech alav chayav." That a person passing the object in the public domain from point A to point B, and the 2 points are a distance of 4 amos, but in the middle, the person holds it over themselves, which is, as we spoke about before, above 10 tefachim, and therefore makom patur. Nonetheless, since they started in one place in the public domain, they ended in point B, which is more than 4 amos away, even though they passed by their own, put it over their head, which is makom patur in the middle, they're still going to be v'avir derech alav chayav, they're going to be chayav b'chatas. Now, similarly, our Mishnah, which is talking about a case where a person standing in, let's just talk about the second scenario, which I mentioned earlier, which a person standing on a rooftop, and they're moving an object from point A to point B. Now, presumably, if they're moving from point A to point B, they may be holding it up above the 10 tefachim, or they may have been moving it onto the rooftop, and then they put it down. So that's similar to Rava's case, where a person is bringing it from point A to point B, and there is a makom patur, or at least not a public domain, in the middle. So the Gemara says, "Miktanim hoti chayiv chatas, dilmum hoti patur glaser." The Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says there's no explicit implication in the Mishnah to this effect, because all the Mishnah said is that you should not do so. Now it doesn't say, and if you do so, you're going to be chayiv chatas. It could just say, if you do so, it's usher, it's forbidden, but you're not necessarily going to bring a chatas. And Rava's novelty, the chiddush of Rava, is that he's saying you're going to be chayiv chatas, but there's no definitive proof. Now the Gemara has a different version of the previous discussion. Ikad Amri, there are those who report the discussion in the following fashion: hahotzi patur v'asar. The implication of the Mishnah is that if you do it, meaning Gemara says don't do it. If you do it, it's forbidden, but there's no implication that you're going to be chayiv chatas. The Gemara says you have to Rava. So now the Gemara is saying it the other way. The Gemara is saying, okay, the implication of Mishnah would therefore be a rejection of Rava, because right now the Gemara is assuming the implication of the Mishnah is that if you do so, it's forbidden, but not that you're going to be chayiv chatas. So the Gemara says, Rava, as Rava said, because Rava taught us that if you go from one place in the public domain to another place in the public domain, but you pass it over yourself, meaning mikom patur above 10 tefachim, you are going to be chayiv chatas. And right now we're understanding the implication of the Mishnah to mean that it is forbidden, but not that you're going to be chayiv chatas. The Gemara says, no, miktani hotzi patur v'aser. Does it say anywhere in the Mishnah explicitly that if you do this, it's forbidden, but you do not bring a korban chatas? Tell them hotzi chayiv chatas. Maybe if it's done, you do bring a korban chatas. Therefore, the bottom line is our Mishnah doesn't reject or prove Rava's position in any way. Then the Gemara can analyze the next ruling in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, a person should stand in the private domain and urinate in the public domain. Amar Rav Yosef Hishtin v'rak chayiv chatas. A person who does urinate or does spit, they are going to be chayiv chatas. If, let's say, a person is standing in the private domain and they spit into the public domain, or urinating from one domain to another, you're going to be chayiv chatas. Ask the Gemara, but don't we when we talk about akira and anacha, we normally need it to be from one place which is at least 4 tefachim wide to another place which is at least 4 tefachim wide. Veleka, over here, the place, the urine or the saliva is not on a place which is 4 tefachim wide. The saliva comes from one's mouth, the urine comes from one's bladder, and therefore that is not a place which is 4 tefachim wide. So how could you say that you're going to be chayiv chatas? Normally that has to be the case. So Rav Yosef answers, machshavto meshavi lemakom. The person's intention is to make it a significant area. Now, what that means is as follows. Let's give the case, then we'll explain a little more. If you don't say this, if you don't say that, Rava said the following: Zarak benach b'fia kelev o b'fia kivshan. A person throws an object and it lands in the mouth of a dog or in the opening of a furnace, like a fire. Chayiv chatas, you're going to be chayiv chatas. Now, how does that work? The dog's mouth is not 4 by 4 tefachim, nor Neither is the furnace, okay? So how does that work? So Veleka, you don't have that proper space. The person's intention makes it a significant space. So here too, the person's intention makes it a significant space. Now, Tosfos explains it doesn't mean your intention, because every case, anytime I'm going to throw something that is less than 4 by 4 tefachim, obviously I intended to throw it there. So it doesn't mean intention. What it means is your intention / benefit. In other words, you have a unique benefit. Let's say I have like a dog cookie, so I want to throw it in the dog's mouth, because it's not just that I have intention for it to be there. There's a particular benefit of it falling in that place, or I want to burn something, so I have a particular benefit of it being in the fire. So here too, a person wants, so in as much as your intention / benefit is enough to override the regular need for 4 by 4 tefachim, and because it makes, what's the whole idea of 4 by 4 tefachim? It's a significant space. So here too, the dog's mouth, because it's something that I want to do and something I benefit from, therefore it's considered a significant space, even though it doesn't fulfill those dimensions. Similarly over here, when a person is urinating, a person is spitting, even though the place where it's coming from is less than 4 by 4, since I want it to come from the space and I'm benefiting from it coming from that space, therefore it's considered a makom chashuv, a significant space. Okay, 99a2. Rava asked a question. Let's say a person is in the private domain and they are urinating against the public domain, but their bladder is in the private domain, their body's there, but their male organ is in the public domain. So do we go from the place where the urine was dislodged, i.e. the bladder, or do we look at the place where it exited from the body, which is the organ? So the Gemara says, we leave it unresolved. Okay, fine. Rabbi Yehuda says, now in our Mishnah, the Mishnah told us that you can't spit from the private domain to the public domain. Rabbi Yehuda came along and said that if a person has saliva in their mouth, starts to collect in their mouth. Of course, you always have saliva in your mouth, but it starts to collect. You know what I mean? You start to have like a pool of saliva in your mouth. Rabbi Yehuda says if you walk 4 amos with that saliva in your mouth, you are going to be chayav chatas. Okay? So the Gemara asks, is that so? Even if you didn't swirl it around? In other words, there's different steps. There's just like, hey, there's saliva in your mouth, and then it starts to pool, and then you start to like swirl it around. So is that so? The Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's considered detached from one's mouth even before you swirl it around. That's not. It was taught in the Mishnah. Okay, a person's eating a cake of truma figs with soiled, meaning unwashed hands. Okay, what that means is as follows. Truma is something which cannot become tamei. If it comes into contact with something which is a sheni l'tuma, which is a second degree of tuma, we're not going to get into all the rules of tuma right now. If it comes into contact with something which is a sheni l'tuma, then it becomes tamei. Okay. Now, hands, if they're unwashed, are considered sheni l'tuma. That is one of the reasons ultimately why we wash tilas yadayim before we eat, but for another discussion for another time. The bottom line is that you have your figs over here, which are truma. You have your hands, which are sheni l'tuma. The thing is like this. For something to become tamei, it has to first become susceptible to tuma, and how that happens is only if it has liquid touching on it, okay? So let's say a person's eating, and their hands are not washed, okay? They put their hands into the mouth to get something out of their mouth, like something like a rock, whatever, something stuck in their mouth. Rabbi Meir matame. Rabbi Meir says the figs become tamei as well, because once you come into contact with the liquid, the spit in your mouth, and then you touch the figs, now they're tamei. Rabbi Yossi Matahir, he says no, saliva in one's mouth is not considered a liquid. It's part of your mouth. It's just part of your mouth. It's not considered a liquid. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and this is what we're getting at. Hibich ba tamei lo hibich ba tahar. If the person swirled the saliva around in their mouth, then they're tamei. If you didn't swirl it around, then they're tahar. So what do you see? You see that Rabbi Yehuda, it's not enough for it to just be pooling in one's mouth, it has to be swirling around, and yet for it to be separate from the mouth. And yet over here in our Mishnah, where he talks about traveling in the public domain, he says as long as it's pooled together, even if it's not swirling. So Rav Yochanan, we're going to see 2 possible answers. Rav Yochanan muchlefes hashita. Rav Yehuda changed his mind. In other words, initially he held that as long as it was collected in one's mouth, then it's going to be seen separate, i.e. our mission over here in Mesechus Eruvin. And then later on, he said no, that's not separate enough. It's only when you start swirling it that's when it's really going to be separate. So Rish Lakish Amar Lilam Tachlif. You don't have to reverse Rav Yehuda's statement. Hachmaiskinan bechicho. The case in our Mishnah is not spit, it's phlegm. Okay, phlegm is much more separate already. In other words, phlegm is something which is much more natural to just spit out, as opposed to spit, which is just liquid. Phlegm, much more naturally want to get out, and therefore even before it starts swirling, as soon as it collects in one's mouth, it's already seen as separate. So basically what we're saying according to Rish Lakish is as follows. Our Mishnah is talking about phlegm, and it's saying if you have phlegm in your mouth and you walk 4 amos, you are going to be chayav chatas. It's aser. You just carried something in Rosh Hashanah. And when it comes to spit just collecting in your mouth is not enough. When you start swirling it around as its own entity, that's when it becomes a separate thing. Vatanya, the Gemara asks a question, or Shlakish's explanation, Omer, Kicho v'nislash, a person, if phlegm collected in one's mouth, and then a person walks for amos, then you're going to be chayiv. My love, rok v'nislash, it would seem to be also true for saliva. The Gemara says, no, kicho v'nislash. The Gemara says, no. It's a hard shock of to understand, but because he just said, no, it's specifically phlegm. That's what the Gemara answers. No, the Brisa is referring to phlegm, but saliva, again, has to be swirled around. Tanya, the Brisa, we ask another question. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kicho shenislash v'chein ruko shenislash lehalach arba amos achiarok. Rabbi Yehuda there says explicitly, if phlegm collected or saliva collected, then a person cannot walk 4 amos until one spits it out. Here he says explicitly that the halacha with phlegm and spit is the same. So the Gemara says, you're right, we had to reject Reish Lakish's answer, and we go back to Rabbi Yochanan's answer, and really there is no distinction made between spit and phlegm. The only thing is that initially Rabbi Yehuda held that as long as you swirl it around, that's already separate, and then he ultimately concluded, even if you don't swirl it around, initially he said, even if it's not swirled around, it's separate. And then he said, ultimately, it's only when you swirl it around, that's when it's considered separate. Amar Reish Lakish, Kicho, now we have just a parenthetical halacha. Kiach b'fnei rabo chaymis, a person spits in front of their teacher, they're liable to death. Shnemar kol misanai ahavu maves. All those, pasuk in Mishlei, all those who hate me, i.e. the Torah, love death. Those who hate me, rather ela masni'ai, those who cause the Torah to be hated. In other words, person spitting in public, that's seen as a vulgar thing, and if a person says, oh, that's a Talmid Chacham, that's a scholar, that's a person who's connected to Torah, and they're doing such a thing, that is something which causes people to hate the Torah. So the commentators point out this is true even if it's not in front of one's teacher, it's just more vulgar if it's not in front of someone you're supposed to be respecting, but a person spits in general, that causes people to hate the Torah. Okay? Because they're doing vulgar activity. Honest, Gemara says, what do you mean? There's phlegm in the person's mouth. They're forced to do it, so to speak. In other words, what are they supposed to do with it? So, kiach v'ra kamrinan. We're discussing a case, a person who coughed up the phlegm in his mouth and then spat it out. In other words, we're not talking about a case where a person was forced to, spit it out, just came out. Okay, it just comes out, it comes out. But a person who goes ahead and they're making a choice, they cough it up and then they spit it out, that is seen as a vulgar thing. But but otherwise, if it happens against someone's will, that would be okay. That's not what we're talking about. And what a person should do if they need to spit, put it into a napkin, put on the side. It should not be done in a public fashion. Okay, new Mishnah. Lo yamid adam rishus or yachavish rishus ram. Person shouldn't stand in a public domain and in a private domain and drink in a public domain. Rishus ram vish rishus yachid. Nor should they stand in the public domain and drink from the private domain. Elam ken hichnis rosho v'rubel makam shushose. Unless they put their entire body into that space. In other words, the concern, I'm going to be drinking water, and let's say I'm holding over into the public domain and I'm drinking water. This is coffee, but I'm drinking water in this domain, and I'm going to be, there's a concern that I may bring it back with me. So therefore I have to put my whole body into this next domain, and then I could drink there, and that's going to be okay? V'chein begas, and the same applies to a wine press. We'll come back and discuss what it means, v'chein begas, in a moment. Reisha Rabbanan, the first part of the Mishnah, is the Rabbanan. In other words, the last Mishnah, which allowed a person to stand in one domain and handle things in another domain, that seems to go like the Rabbanan, V'sefer Rameir. But the next Mishnah, this Mishnah, which is also anonymous, it seems to go like Rameir, because it's saying that we're concerned that a person handling something in the other domain is going to bring it into their domain, right? Mishnah before, we saw someone standing in public domain and dealing something in the private domain, no problem. We weren't concerned the person is going to bring it into their domain. And yet in our Mishnah over here, a person is standing in one domain, and we're told that you cannot be in the other, you can't handle something in the other domain unless you put your whole body into the other domain. So that's strange that you have two Mishnahs side by side, one both anonymous, one going like the Rabbanan Shita, one going like Rameir Shita. Rav Yosef b'chafetzin shetzrichen lo. Our Mishnah is dealing with objects that a person needs, since what that means is that we're dealing with water, the person wants the water. There, even the Rabbanan who said earlier that a person's allowed to stand in the public domain and deal with something in the private domain, or in the private domain and deal with something in the public domain, we're not going to be concerned because they're dealing with whatever object it is. Over here, we're dealing with an object which a person really needs. The person's thirsty, whatever it is, and there's a concern the person's going to bring into their domain. Even though Rabbanan would agree, you need to have most of your body there. Ibai the Gemara asks, harmless mai. Okay, so we're talking about public and private domain, which is biblical. What about if we're dealing with rabbinic prohibition, i.e., person standing in a carmelis drinking rishus yachid, etc. Rabbi hihi, same halacha. Rava hi guf gzera. I don't understand. The whole law of a carmelis is a rabbinic decree. here. We're going to add a level of decree upon decree. That doesn't make any sense. Abai says, no, I'll prove it to you. It says in our Mishnah, our Mishnah said also in a wine press. Now, what does it mean in a wine press? A wine press is what presumably the interpretation of the Mishnah is that a person standing in a public domain and they are leaning over into a wine press, which is a carmelis. A carmelis is not a private domain, and they're leaning into a carmelis, and you see that the same and the Mishnah concluded the words also in a carmelis, which means also in a wine press, which means that it also applies to carmelis. Rava Amar Lini Meiser. Rava says no. The last line of the Mishnah has nothing to do with the laws of Shabbos, rather it's to do with the laws of Meiser. What that means is as follows. Let's just quickly introduce this. What this means is that when it comes to Meiser, you're only obligated to tithe things if they are processed, if they're seen as like no longer like if you finish the processing. Okay, what that means is that you're allowed to snack on food before bringing Meiser. So when a person's like working in the fields or preparing wine, you're allowed to snack on objects. And the question though is, till what point is it considered snacking, and what point is it considered like you're done with the processing? So we're going to see machlokas. Rav Sheshes also says the last line of Mishnah that the same applies for wine press refers to Meiser, meaning what is that? It's intent shos and alagas. Rameir, as we're about to see, says you're allowed to drink wine over the wine press. Bein bechamin, whether the wine is hot. Vein bitzonin, whether it's cold. Upater, and a person's exempt from tithing it to Rameir. Those are the words Rameir. Eliezer batzadik mechayev. Eliezer. Okay, basically what he's saying is if I'm drinking over the wine press, I'm going to be exempt. Okay, now those words are the words that we're going to be focusing on, and we're going to just finish the Mishnah in a moment. But what that means is that when you're exempt when rosh over rubo is over the gas, when most of your body is over the wine press, then we're seen as like, oh, that's still snacking. It's like you didn't take it out of the wine press. Second, I take it away from the wine press, then it's already finished the processing. But as long as I'm over it, Rameir is saying, whether it's hot, whether it's cold, you're exempt from the wine press. You're exempt from tithing the wine because you are still seen as like being part of the processing as opposed to being done, right? And that's what that last line of the Mishnah said, because what the Mishnah was saying before is that I'm not allowed to stand in public domain and drink from the private public, unless most of my body is over the line. So similarly with the wine press, or mayor who said that I'm allowed to drink wine in a wine press, it's only when most of my body is over the line. Now I'll just finish the machlokas. Rabbi Tzadok says no. Once, even if a person drinks from the wine press itself, you do have to bring meiser. That's already, the processing is already done. If you drink hot water, then you are going to be exempt. Hot wine, excuse me. If the wine is hot, you're exempt. Why? Sorry, the opposite. If it's hot, then you're obligated. Why? Because when it's hot, you're not going to be able to pour that back into the wine press. But if it's cold, you're allowed to pour the wine back in, and therefore you're like whatever you don't want, you're allowed to pour back in, which means it's not really done the processing because you're going to put it back into the wine press, and therefore you're going to be exempt. Bottom line is that our Mishnah, the last line of our Mishnah, which said V'chimikas, was saying that in as much as when it comes to drinking water from a private domain to a public domain or vice versa, you have to be leaning over entirely. So too with the wine press, you have to be leaning over entirely. According to a mayor who says you're exempt from bringing meiser, only when you're leaning over entirely. Have a great day.